gracias. Les pido que por favor reciban al profesor Lennox con un caluroso aplauso. Señoras y señores, muchas gracias por la invitación de dar una conferencia en esta sala muy hermosa, como en Oxford. Hace casi 50 años he aprendido un poco de castellano, pero ahora soy viejo y el cerebro no puede recordar las palabras españoles. Y entonces es necesario continuar en inglés. One of the great advantages of being at Cambridge and at Oxford is that every year I win the boat race. Our title tonight has science buried God. The title refers particularly to the natural sciences. And there is a widespread impression in many parts of the world, but particularly Europe, that there is an irreconcilable tension between God on the one side and science on the other. I wish to suggest this is entirely false, because we only have to look at the Nobel Prize for Physics to see what the real issue is. A couple of years ago, the Nobel Prize for Physics was won by a Scotsman, Peter Higgs. The Higgs boson has become very famous. He is an atheist. Some years earlier, the same prize was won by William Phillips of the United States. He is a Christian. Both of them are brilliant. They have won the Nobel Prize, so they are not divided by their science. They are divided by their worldview. One is an atheist, the other a theist. And if we're going to understand the contemporary debate, we need to realize that that's where the tension lies. It is a tension between two diametrically opposed worldviews: theism, belief in God, and atheism, rejection of God. And there are scientists on both sides of that debate. So it clearly is not a war between science and religion. Indeed, it is interesting to learn that between 1900 and 2000, that is 100 years, 65% of Nobel Prize winners have been believers in God. Now, the tension between these two worldviews is very old. If you go back to ancient Greece, you had the atomists, Democritus and Leucippus, who believed that ultimate reality consisted of two things: atoms and empty space. That was all that existed. And therefore, their idea of explanation was reductionistic. Everything must be explained in terms of atoms and empty space, because that is all that exists. They are the early materialists, and their view is held by many people today. Indeed, it is probably the dominant worldview in Western academies, held by people like Richard Dawkins and so on. But also, at that time in the ancient world, there were people like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, who believed that there was more than atoms and empty space. There was transcendence, which they formulated in different ways. There were the gods, or there was God. But at any rate, there was something more. Mass energy was not the only thing in existence. And it's obvious that those two worldviews are opposed to one another, and they divide the contemporary academy. So instead of asking questions about science versus religion, the real question that faces us is this: which way does science point, if any? Does science support atheism, as Richard Dawkins and many others claim? Or does science support theism? Or is it completely neutral? Now, I am a mathematician, a pure mathematician. And we pure mathematicians have a very rigorous concept of proof. A proof starts with axioms and uses logic to reach a conclusion. In that sense, we cannot prove that God exists or that he does not exist. But there is a second use of the word proof in most languages, and that is evidence, indicators. That does not mean they are weak. For instance, I have been married to the same person for nearly 50 years. I cannot prove to you mathematically that she loves me, but I'd risk my life on it. I came to Spain on a jet aircraft. I couldn't prove to you mathematically that it would get me here, but I trusted it with my life. So we must not think that because we do not have mathematical proof, that we cannot have evidence that is very strong. And I want to bring that kind of evidence from several sources: the history of science, the philosophy of science, and possibly the results of science. So let's contextualize this in history. Modern science exploded in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries under people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Pascal, Boyle, Faraday, Babbage, and so on. All of the people I've mentioned, and many more, were Christians. They were theists. They believed in God. And they were the pioneers of contemporary science. Now, historians and philosophers of science have been very interested in this, and they've asked the question, is there a connection between belief in God and the rise of science? And the general conclusion is, yes, there is a very deep connection. And C.S. Lewis probably put it best when he said men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed on a lawgiver. Alfred North Whitehead, a brilliant philosopher and historian of science, said that Europe in 1500 knew less than Archimedes, who died in 212 BC. And yet, 200 years later, in 1700, Newton's Principia Mathematica had been written. Why was that possible? Here is North Whitehead's answer. It must come, he says, from the medieval insistence of the rationality of God. Now, this is a very interesting thing to observe, because far from belief in God hindering scientific research, the argument goes the other way. Belief in God was the motor that drove scientific research. People believed in a rational intelligence behind natural phenomena. And so they believed science could be done. It's interesting that, because it shows us that all scientists have faith. Not necessarily in God, but they all have faith that science can be done. I say that because there's a very widespread impression that faith is a religious concept. It is not merely a religious concept. It's a normal word, faith, coming from Latin fides, which means trust, belief. All scientists are believers, as Albert Einstein once wrote. I cannot imagine a scientist without that faith. That is, faith that science can be done. So let me put it provocatively. I am not in the least ashamed to be a Christian and a scientist, for the very simple reason that Christianity gave me my subject. So historically, there is a very strong connection between Christianity and the rise of science. But now comes the odd thing. You get people like Richard Dawkins writing books like The God Delusion, and persuading many people that there is no need to consider the question of God, because God is a fictitious Freudian figure with no real existence. And many people say to me, your God is like Santa Claus. Belief in God is like a child's belief in the tooth fairy. That's a very curious thing to say. I was debating a physicist in the Netherlands, and he said, your belief in God is like belief in Santa Claus. And I said, well, we should test that with the audience. So I asked everyone in the audience to put up their hand if they came to believe in Santa Claus as an adult. And there were nearly 2,000 people there, and there was not one hand went up. And then I said, how many of you came to believe in God as an adult? And hundreds of hands went up. And I turned to this physicist and I said, this is an absurdly childish argument. To put God in the same category as Santa Claus is foolish intellectually, because some of the best brains of history has spent years thinking about the nature of God and writing about the nature of God. There is no such literature about Santa Claus. Of course, Freud is very powerful and very popular still, although not in psychiatry. And the argument that God is a father figure in the sky sounds very impressive. And there's a leading German psychiatrist called Manfred Lutz who's written a book about this, and he said, well, if there is no God, then the Freudian argument that God is a fiction is very good, if there is no God. Of course, he says, if there is a God, the very same argument shows you that atheism is a wish fulfillment. The desire never to have to meet God, for instance, to be judged for the mess that we've made of our lives and the lives of others. As the Polish Nobel Prize winner for literature, Czesław Miłosz, put it, atheism is the great opium of the people. The desire never to have to face the crimes and injuries that we have done to others. So if there is no God, oh, Freud has a wonderful argument that religion is a fiction. If there is a God, the same argument shows you that atheism is a fiction. And then Lutz says, as to the real question, is there a God or not, Freud cannot help you at all. And that came out in rather an amusing way when Stephen Hawking, the world's most famous living scientist, was asked what he thought of religion. And he said, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And I was asked to comment on this profound statement. And I asked the newspaper, I think it was the Times, did they want one-line answer? Oh, they said, please, we want a one-line answer. So I'm afraid I was rather cheeky, and I suggested, okay then, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Now you shouldn't laugh, because if you've been following my argument, you'll see those statements prove nothing. We need to look deeper. So let's have a look and see what's going on here. Isaac Newton is a very good person to think about because he discovered the law of gravitation and he put it into his book Principia Mathematica. For him, it was a wonderful reason to believe in God. When he discovered his mathematical description of the universe, he did not say, I have a scientific explanation, therefore I do not need God. No. He said, what a marvelous God to do it that way. And the more he understood of the universe, the more he admired the God that had done it that way. Stephen Hawking, on the other hand, he studies gravity. And until recently, he had the same chair in Oxford as Isaac Newton. And now he's just written a book, The Grand Design, and he claims that gravity is his reason for not believing in God. So for Isaac Newton, gravity was a reason to believe in God, and for Stephen Hawking, it's a reason not to believe in God. Now, I find paradoxes like that extremely interesting. And we can focus our discussion very easily in asking, how do you move from Newton to Hawking? What's the difference? What are the arguments? What has changed? And I want to suggest that at the heart of this matter, there is a number of serious confusions. In fact, I describe it as an intellectual fog. Deep misunderstandings about, firstly, the nature of God, and secondly, the nature of scientific explanation. The first reason may surprise you, and it was only relatively recently that it occurred to me that it was important. Many years ago, when I was young, sometime last century or the century before, when I used the word God, people understood exactly what I meant. I meant the eternal creator God described in the Bible, who upholds the universe. But that is no longer true, because nowadays many intellectuals think that the only kind of gods are the gods of the ancient mythologies, Roman, Greek, Babylonian, Assyrian, and so on. There's a great problem with that view, because experts on the topic of ancient gods, a topic that interests me greatly, point out that there's a vast difference between the God of the Bible and the ancient gods. Werner Jaeger in Oxford put it this way. He says the ancient gods are descended from the heavens and the earth. That is, they are material gods. They are created by the basic stuff in the universe. These mythologies all have theogonies. That is, how did the gods come to exist? They do not only have cosmogonies, how did the universe come to exist? There is no theogony in the Bible because God is eternal. And Werner Jaeger says the ancient gods are descended from the heavens and the earth. The God of the Bible created the heavens and the earth. That's a vast difference of category. But now, if you think of all gods, including the God of the Bible, as ancient Greek gods, you end up with thinking that God is a God of the gaps. Now, let me explain that. The Greek god of lightning was really postulated because the ancients were afraid of lightning. They couldn't understand it. So a god was behind it. Now, if you went to the University of Madrid and did the first lecture on atmospheric physics, the god of lightning would disappear. Science would have buried that god, because that God is not necessary, because the God was postulated as a fictive explanation that goes like this: I can't explain it, therefore the God of lightning did it. And many people think that the God of the Bible is like that. And so Stephen Hawking says to people, look, if you want to be regarded as an intelligent, scientifically literate person in the world today, you must choose between God and science. You cannot have both. His reasoning has to do with the nature of God. The logic is this, and it's very simple, really. You see, if you believe that God is simply a God of the gaps, I can't explain it, therefore God did it, then you've got to choose between science and God, because that's the way you've defined God. That kind of God disappears, is buried by science. The God of the Bible is not like that. I'm sure many of you have read the first statement in the Bible, in Genesis. In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe that we do not yet understand. Well, of course not. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is, He created everything. The bits we do understand and the bits we don't. And here we can come back to Newton's attitude. If you go to the Prado just up the road and look at a painting by Velázquez, the more you know about art, the more you could admire his genius. I don't know much about art. I wish I did. I look at it and I see a picture, but you're an expert and you could say, just look at the mastery of light in that face. And you would have to teach me to see that. The more you understand of art, the more you can admire the genius of the artist who created that painting, not the less. The more you know of engineering, the more you can admire a turbojet engine, not the less. The more you know of the universe, like Newton, the more you can worship and admire the God that did it that way, not the less. Because God is not a God of the gaps. That's the first point. Problems with the idea of God. But there are other problems that are directly related to them. And that is the status and meaning of scientific explanation. Science explains. How often we hear that? And often the codicil is, and therefore we do not need God. That's Hawking's view. But what does it mean that science explains? Let's stick with the law of gravity. I love the law of gravity. I was taught it at school, and then later I learned to derive the motion of the planets from it. And that was really exciting stuff. But my teacher at school made a profound mistake because he didn't know very much, unfortunately. He taught me that the law of gravity explained gravity. It was only much later I learned that nobody can explain gravity. Newton himself recognized that. Non fingo hypothesi. I do not feign hypotheses. I do not have an explanation of gravity. What he had was a brilliant equation that helped us to do things with gravity and predict orbits and all this kind of thing. But still today, no one knows what gravity is. So even within itself, to say that science explains, you have to be very careful, because even within science, that explanation may be just partial. That's number one. Now, number two. Why is the kettle boiling? Well, because heat energy is being conducted through the copper kettle and is agitating the molecules of water. And as they get hotter and hotter, they move faster and faster, and the water starts to boil. Yes? No. The water is boiling because I would love a cup of tea. Now, what a foolish thing to say. No. It's boiling because I would love a cup of tea. Because you see, both of those explanations are correct. But they are different kinds of explanation. The first explanation is a scientific one. The second is a personal agent explanation. I desire a cup of tea. And I'm telling you the truth, by the way, I do desire a cup of tea, but water will have to do. Now, do those explanations compete with one another? No. Do they conflict with one another? No. Do they contradict one another? No. They complement one another. And you need both. Incidentally, which of the two explanations do you think is more important? Well, the physics explanation is important if you're in a class learning about heat. But people have been brewing and drinking tea for thousands of years before they knew anything about heat equations. It's actually the personal explanation that is more important in this case. Now, this helps us see what's going on in the debate. Stephen Hawking thinks that the only valid explanation of the universe is the scientific one. That's like saying the only valid explanation of the boiling water is the one in terms of heat physics. But that's sheer nonsense. But they're different kinds of explanation. Let me put it this way. God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for a motor car engine. They're different kinds of explanation. Now, incidentally, you can study a motor car engine for 1,000 years and you'll never find Henry Ford. But the marks of his intelligence are all over it. And it's the same with the universe. You'll not find God by studying the interior of stars, but the whole fact that we can do science is evidence that there is a God. Now, Dawkins, his major argument in his book, The God Delusion, is this. He says, but just wait. You see, if you claim that God created the universe, logically you will have to ask, who created God? You've heard that argument, yes? And then you will have to ask, who created the God that created the God that created the God that created, and so on, back forever, which is nonsense. So there is no God. I was staggered when I read that argument. I get it sometimes in schools. I didn't expect to find it from Professor Dawkins. Why not? Well, think about it logically. The question, who created God, has a hidden assumption built into it. Let's abstract from it one level. If I ask, who or what created X? What's the assumption? The assumption is that X was created, obviously. So if you ask who created God, you're assuming God was created. But what if he wasn't? As the Bible claims that he's eternal. Your question doesn't apply. Full stop. It is only a question that is valid for created gods. And you will notice that Dawkins' book is not called The Created God's Delusion, because that's obvious to everybody that created gods are a delusion. It's interesting, I debated him on these things, and by the way, you can see these debates on my website, johnlennox.org, and I said to him, you think this question is valid? Well, in a sense it is. For instance, I said to him, you believe the universe created you. So let me ask you your question. Who created your creator? I've waited 9 years for an answer, but I haven't got it yet. It's a non-question, and yet it's the heart of his argument. I find that quite striking. Now, I have already said that there is a problem. In Europe particularly, but elsewhere, there is great confusion about what do we mean when we speak of faith. There is a lot of pressure, in fact, in Europe. Keep your faith private. Well, actually, if you took that logically, it would mean nobody would ever speak again. What people do not realize is that, one, each of us has a worldview. It is our faith, it's what we believe. So if you have to keep your faith private, life would be very dull, wouldn't it? What people mean, of course, is they are using the word faith to define religion only. That's the first mistake. And then, worse still, they are using it to mean believing where there is no evidence. That's actually in one of the world's well-known dictionaries at the moment, Webster's Dictionary in America. Faith, noun, believing where there is no evidence. Now, all traditions religious or otherwise, must and should speak for themselves. I can only speak for a Christian as a Christian. And I want to make it clear, ladies and gentlemen, that the Christian faith is not like that. It is evidence-based. Otherwise, I wouldn't believe it for a nanosecond. And it's important to realize it claims to be evidence-based. One of the clearest statements of this occurs near the end of the Gospel of John, where he's explaining why he wrote his book. And he says, many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, here's the evidence. These signs, semeion, from which we get the word semiotica. These signs that indicate who he is are the basis on which faith can be based. Believing something where there is no evidence is very dangerous. We call it normally blind faith. But unfortunately, the so-called new atheists have been very clever, and they call all faith blind without using the word blind. So that's the first and very big mistake. When I say I believe something or I believe someone, you have every right to ask on what basis. What are the grounds for your faith? And in the case of Christianity, one of the major grounds objectively why I believe Christianity is because there is evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. Evidence that's both historical and evidence that is personal and experiential. It's an evidence-based faith. The other problem with this redefinition of faith is, as I mentioned a little earlier, that it draws attention away from the fact that scientists are people of faith. They believe that science can be done. Now, I sometimes find it interesting to probe this question. And I ask my colleagues in Oxford and elsewhere, what do you do science with? They think, of course, I'm thinking of a laboratory machine that's very expensive. But I say, no, what do you do science with? And they say, oh, you mean my, and they're about to say mind when they're a little bit careful. They remember that there's no such thing as the mind. And they say, my brain. Well, I actually do believe there's such a thing as the mind, that the mind story and the brain story are not and cannot be the same. But don't worry about that. I do science with my brain. Okay. Well, tell me about this apparatus that you do science with. What's the story? What's the story of the brain? Well, the short version is very simple. The brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And then I look at them and I say, and you trust it? Tell me, if you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you use it? And they usually look down and say, no, I wouldn't. That's a big problem, isn't it? And then I say to them, do you know where I got that argument? They usually don't. And I surprise them by telling them that it comes from a man called Charles Darwin. Have you heard of him? Because it was Darwin said, with me, there always arises a horrible doubt whether the convictions of man's mind which, as he believed, had been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Darwin's doubt. Now, Darwin's doubt has moved from the edge to the center of this argument among leading philosophers in the world today. You see, atheism leads to a reductionist view of everything. What do I mean by that? Well, basically it means everything can be explained in the end by physics and chemistry. Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize, wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis. Your joys and your sorrows and so on are no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. It is an astonishing hypothesis, because if it was true, we could never know it. As was pointed out long before Crick, that if my thoughts are simply the random motions of elementary particles in my brain, then I would never know that my brain was composed of elementary particles. So here's an interesting thing, that the rejection of God means that explanation within science must always be bottom up, because there is no top. And it leads to a real problem with faith. That is, the faith I need to do science. Not faith in God, the faith I need to do science. Alvin Plantinga is one of the world's leading Christian philosophers. And he says, if Dawkins is right, that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' science and his atheism. Well, you might expect a Christian philosopher to write like that, although Plantinga is world class. So now let's go to one of the world's leading atheist philosophers, Thomas Nagel of New York, who wrote a book with the most explosive subtitle I have ever seen, relatively recently. The book is called Mind and Cosmos. Well, that's innocent enough. But here's the subtitle. This is an atheist writing. He's a hard atheist in the sense that he writes, he says, I do not want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. And here's what he says. If the mental thinking is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we should not take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which that naturalism depends. In other words, there's something seriously wrong with naturalistic philosophy. Why? Because it undermines all rationality. There's a big problem with explanation. And now I'm going to say something very provocative. The title is, Has Science Buried God? My answer is no. But it now seems to me that science is beginning to bury atheism, because you can't have both. If you want science, you must have a basis for confidence in rationality. Atheism removes it. But this reductionism is so important I want to tell you a little story to illustrate it. Would you like a little story at this time of the night? It's about Oxford and my own college, which has a beautiful dining hall. And one night a week we have candlelit dinners. They're very nice. The only problem with them is that you're told where to sit. And that normally is a very good thing. But sometimes it can be very embarrassing. As it was on one occasion when I was standing beside the guest of the evening. I'd never met him before. And I asked him what he did, as is common. And he said, well, he was a biochemist and led a very big unit in biochemistry. And he said, and what about you? Well, I said, I'm afraid I'm a pure mathematician. His reply to that was, how awfully boring. And I could see he meant it. So I just said, well, I said, okay, I know my subject is socially not perhaps the most acceptable. So I tried to make up for that by being interested in the big questions. He said, what big questions? Very suspicious. I said, big questions like, what is the status of the universe? Is it created or not? Or, what is the status of human life? Is it made in the image of God or not? Oh, he said, it's far worse than I thought. He said, listen, I'm an atheist. I'm a reductionist. We have nothing to talk about, and we're going to have the most miserable evening. Good start for a dinner party. So I said, really? You're a reductionist? I said, that's very interesting to me. He said, is it? I said, yes. I said, I know at least 3 different kinds of reductionism. Which kind are you? Well, he said, I don't know what name you would put on it, but I take a big problem, I divide it into little problems, I study them and hope to get insight on the big problems. I said, well, I do that too. Both of us are methodological reductionists. So I said, we have something to talk about. Oh, but he said, I don't really mean that. I said, I know you don't. You are an ontological reductionist. From the Greek word ontos, meaning being. You think that everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry, and therefore you think that produces atheism. He said exactly, and therefore we have nothing to talk about. Well, so I said, oh, well, that's really fascinating. Why don't we do an experiment? He said, at the dinner table. I said, yes, this is Oxford. So he said, what's the experiment? Well, I said, have a look at this. So I picked up the menu. It wasn't very inspiring. It wasn't even in French. It said roast chicken. Pollo, you know. So he said, it says roast chicken. I said, how do you know? Well, he says it. But I said, those are just marks on paper. Oh, he said, but look, that's a language, it's English. Oh, I said, that's interesting. You're a reductionist, yes. Everything can be explained only in terms of physics and chemistry, yes. So I said, here's the problem. Not for me, but for you. You explain to me the semiotics of those marks, R, O, A, S, T, using only the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. There was dead silence. The silence was broken by his wife. And she said, rather too loudly, get out of that if you can. He didn't try. He said something so honest that I've never forgotten it, although I've heard it from other people. he said, I can't do it. What's more, he said, it cannot be done. And he says, you know, I have gone into my laboratory every day for the last 40 years thinking it could be done. I was staggered. So I said, just wait a minute. Physics and chemistry have only been going properly for 500 or 600 years. He said, it doesn't matter. It's not within the explanatory power of physics and chemistry to cope with language and meaning. And he looked at me for a long time and then he said, where did you get that argument? He could say I wasn't bright enough to think of it myself. And of course, that's perfectly true. So I said, I got it from a Nobel Prize winner. Oh, he said, what a relief. But then I pushed it. R-O-A-S-T. How many letters is that? 5? Because you see, he studied DNA. He works on the longest word that has ever been discovered. The genetic code. 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order. So I said, as you look at that, tell me about it. What's its ultimate origin? Oh, he said, chance and necessity, chance and the laws of nature. I said, do you really believe that? Because you've just looked at 5 letters and you have immediately concluded that there's a mind behind it. Now, a number of automatic processes went into producing that menu. But because there's a semiotic dimension, signs carrying meaning, you have concluded that somewhere in the background there is an intelligence. Why don't you do the same for a word that's 3.5 billion letters long? Why don't they, ladies and gentlemen? Because they're a priori committed to naturalistic explanations, and they daren't go down that road. There's a big tension between the worldviews, isn't there? Do you see the difference between them now? Sharply focused. In the beginning was mass energy, or the particles in the vacuum. But currently, it's not that at all. It's in the beginning was nothing. And if you want to ask me a question about nothing, I will happily talk about it. I give many lectures about nothing. And everything develops from nothing, or a quantum vacuum, and so on. The alternative is, in the beginning was the Word. Diametrically opposite. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him, and without him, nothing came to be that came to be. Now, I mentioned that Stephen Hawking rejects God because of gravity. Let's see how he does it. I gave you the central argument of the God Delusion, which is a non-question. Here's the central argument of the grand design as I come to my conclusion. Hawking writes, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, when I first read that, I thought, excuse me? Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Flat contradiction, number 1. Number 2, because there is a law of gravity. He doesn't say because gravity exists, and this opens a window into another confusion. What is the status of law? Does it create things? Well, of course not. I once asked another famous atheist in Oxford, Peter Atkins, professor of physical chemistry, what created the universe? And he said mathematics. And I'm afraid I was so surprised I started to laugh, which was very rude. And he said, why do you laugh? Well, I said, Peter, I am a mathematician, and I must be honest with you, that's the most stupid thing I've ever heard. He said, why? Well, I said, let me keep it simple. 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever put €2 in your pocket? Just as a little aside, ladies and gentlemen, have you heard of the financial crisis? Do you know what caused that partially? Some people believed that doing mathematics could create money. But mathematics doesn't create anything, it describes. Newton's laws of motion will describe the movement of a billiard ball, a little bit anyway, but they won't cause the ball to move. People with a cue do that. And this is a huge confusion that the laws of nature are causes. They're not. They're descriptions of what is there. So a law of gravity is meaningless if gravity isn't already present. So that's problem number 2. And here comes problem number 3. The universe will create itself. Well, if I say X creates Y, what does that mean? It roughly means if you've got X, you'll get Y. And if I say X creates X, what does that mean? It means if you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? Well, it means that nonsense remains nonsense even if scientists write it. This is the central argument of Hawking's book, Rejecting God. It's got 3 distinct levels of absurdity or self-contradiction in it. I find that very worrying. Now, don't misunderstand me, ladies and gentlemen. Stephen Hawking I admire greatly as a mathematician and theoretical physicist. He's a genius. He was a little bit ahead of me in Cambridge, and he's light years ahead of me in his brain power. But I'm afraid in these statements, he is proving the truth of what Einstein wrote years ago. Outside his field, the scientist is a poor philosopher. The arguments I've presented tonight are not difficult because they haven't to do with the nature of science or the results of science. They have mainly to do with the philosophy of science. And it seems to me, therefore, that far from science abolishing God, the very fact that we can do science is evidence for an intelligence behind the universe. That's where the early pioneers started. There's no reason to leave that, especially since the arguments to the contrary are full of self-contradictions or they are plainly false. So it's not simply as a Christian, but because I'm a scientist, that I'm not an atheist. And those words written 20 centuries ago, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was God. All things came to be through him. Those resonate at the deepest level because I see the universe as a product of intelligence and word. And there are the 2 worldviews. And you have to decide between them. Does it start with mass energy or nothing, and it creeps its way up by unguided processes to mind and words, whatever those mean? Or is it the exact opposite way round? That word, personal word, God, is primary, and the universe itself is derivative. There is a final irony in modern science. The attempt to reduce information, semiotics, to physics and chemistry is failing. And an increasing number of people are seeing that it fails. That information is a fundamental quantity distinct from mass and energy. And of course, if that is true, that is the end of materialism, because information, though carried on material things, is not itself material. And the supreme irony of 20th and 21st century physics for me is that physics itself has led to bringing into the very center a concept of information which is itself not material. I think the lesson of that is this, that we need perhaps to take much more seriously the question of the existence of a supreme God who created and sustains this universe. Muchísimas gracias.
La primera pregunta dice: ¿sirve la Biblia para explicar asuntos científicos, incluso cuando la ciencia parece contradecirla? Y el modelo del Big Bang es otra evidencia que apunta en la existencia de Dios.
Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, this is a Q&A. And that means that it is going to be very disappointing. Let me explain why. I've got about 30 or 40 questions here, and I can only give you my initial reaction to some of them. But perhaps that's a good thing, because if you come tonight with a serious question, much more important than anything I can say will be the work you do to get a satisfactory answer to your question. So all I can hope to do is to begin the process of your thought. So let's look for a moment at these two questions. Does the Bible serve to explain scientific things? And behind that question is a statement that is often made that the Bible is not a textbook of science. And of course that is true. I have never taught calculus from the book of Leviticus, and I never shall. It's not designed to teach us science. In fact, it tells us why. Because the Genesis account informs us that God told the first humans to name the animals. That's taxonomy. It is the beginnings of biology, but more fundamental still. Taxonomy is the fundamental intellectual discipline. Whether you work in the sciences or the humanities or in commerce or in nursing or in any area of life, you've got to learn many new words. That's taxonomy. And the Genesis story is clearly saying to humans, this is a wonderful universe, please you go and explore it. You give it the names, and that's real fun to do that. I've done it for most of my life. So that's point number two. Point number three is this, that although the Bible is not designed to teach us details of science, it is not, as Stephen Jay Gould once said, that science is here, the Bible is here, and there is no overlap. There is clearly overlap at a few places. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is a statement about the physical universe that science studies. The same universe that is described in this question, the Big Bang. And the question was, does it give evidence of the existence of God? Well, indirectly it does. Because the Big Bang as you will probably know, is a label on a mystery. Fred Hoyle, who coined the phrase Big Bang, didn't believe in it. And that's why he said, you and your Big Bang. He believed in the steady state of the universe. So Big Bang simply means there was a beginning to space-time. That's exactly what the Bible has been saying, using different words, but has been saying it for several thousand years, actually. And it's interesting because I received this question not long ago at a very prestigious gathering of physicists and philosophers and mathematicians at a famous physical laboratory in Europe. And I don't know what it was I said, but one of the physics professors interrupted me and he said, please tell us you were joking when you said that the Bible could inform us in any way as to issues in science. I said I was not joking. Let me give you a simple example. The statement in Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, is, of course, pre-modern science. It was written thousands of years ago. But dare I suggest to you that if instead of for centuries listening to Aristotle and his ideas of an eternal universe, you had taken the biblical worldview seriously, you might well have looked for evidence for a beginning before you did. You see, you can actually base a prediction, two predictions, very important predictions, on the text of Scripture. One is that science can be done. In fact, God commanded it. Secondly, it claims there was a beginning. Well, you can explore that. So my answer to the question is, you need to be very careful because science mainly deals with the how questions and the why questions of function. It doesn't deal with the big questions of agency and purpose and so on, which actually are the most important questions. And the father of modern science, Roger Bacon, once wrote that God had two books, the book of nature, the book of God's world, and the book of God's word, the Bible. And an educated person needed to be acquainted with both. Okay, what do you think about geocentrism and the flat earth? Not much, actually. I never think about them, except when I'm asked a question, as I have been tonight. But I expect that what the questioner is thinking about is the very important fact that science changes. If we had been having our lecture 500 years ago or so, you might have been seriously interested in asking me what I thought of this heretic Galileo. Goodness me, he is claiming that the earth moves. Have you ever heard such a heresy? Well, it took about 1,700 years to settle that, but I suspect most of you believe that the earth moves. Science changes, and it is a healthy reminder to think that science changes. Sometimes, I was told this in Latvia recently, well, in the olden days, they believed the earth was flat and the earth was at the center of everything. But now we know that Earth is a tiny planet revolving an undistinguished star far out in the arms of a spiral galaxy. In other words, astronomy has dethroned the Earth from the center of the universe and man from the center of all things. Vast universe, ancient universe, how can little humans have any significance whatsoever? My answer to that is quite simple. First of all, position in the universe doesn't determine importance. Your importance does not necessarily rest in what part of Madrid you live in, although it might do a little bit. Secondly, the universe is vast and it's old. But if we asked, could there be a reason for that? The astrophysicists will tell us, well, look, you are made of carbon. And if you want to get carbon in any quantities, you have to have an old universe. And since it's expanding, it will have to be a very vast universe. So it's exactly the opposite of what is being suggested, that human beings must be vastly important because it took a colossal universe for them to live in. And then our size, we're very tiny. But how are you measuring size? Linearly or logarithmically? If you use logarithms, a human being is almost exactly halfway between the size of an elementary particle and the size of the observed universe. So perhaps we're not that small after all. You can look at things in different ways and with different perspectives, and science has corrected our thinking about certain ideas. Let me illustrate one of them. Before the time of Galileo, and the reason he got into difficulty, was that the Bible claims the earth does not move. God has placed it on its foundations so that it should not move. And there it is. And people say that Galileo is a real example of what I denied at the beginning of my lecture. I said it's not a war between science and religion. And they say, but look at Galileo. Look at how he was persecuted. Well, he wasn't exactly persecuted. But we need to realize historically that Galileo was not first attacked by the Christian church. He was attacked by the Italian philosophers. And why was that? Because Galileo was going against Aristotle. They all believed Aristotle, the earth doesn't move. Now, the church had interpreted certain statements in the Bible as agreeing with Aristotle. So every one of them was an Aristotelian. And so Galileo, who incidentally believed in Scripture all the way through, he was challenging a reigning scientific paradigm, a believer in God challenging it, and he turned out to be right. Now, we smile at that because we have come to see that although the Bible could be interpreted as indicating that the earth didn't move, you don't have to interpret it that way. It's poetic language saying that this earth is stable. Now, if I were to say, why is the earth stable? I'd have to talk to you about an inverse square law of gravity, the existence of our moon, the existence of gas giants and all of that. Those are things that were not understood in those days. So if they believed that it didn't move, that was fine for many centuries because everybody believed it didn't move. But once you had Galileo, who was a moving earther, you can see the little group of moving earthers getting bigger and bigger and bigger until there came a tipping point. And no one in this room, I think, is a fixed earther anymore. So we can learn a great deal from history about these things. And it's a lesson that science can change. Some people are challenging at the moment the idea of a beginning to space-time. One of the reasons for doing that, they will say, is because it's too close to the Bible. Now, I told you I was old. I remember the 1960s. Wow. And I remember when the first scientific, strong statements about a beginning started to be published. The very top people in British science resisted it. Our top scientific periodical, Nature, they wrote and said, we must not go along with this. Why? It sounds too close to the Bible. And the irony of that is one of the greatest cosmological discoveries of the 20th century was resisted because it appeared to echo Genesis 1. How much time have we got? Oh, wow. Okay. So let's look at, here's a question. Do you believe that the creation really happened in 7 days? That is a fascinating question, so fascinating that I've written a book about it. And in order to give you a sensible answer, you should have invited me to give you a lecture on it. But I'm not going to. So I'll have to leave you to my book. I'm sorry. But in order to take it seriously and deal with it properly, you need quite a lot of time, because you need to talk. I've talked a little bit about Galileo, and it could easily lead into this discussion. But for those of you who are interested, I've written a book called 7 Days That Divide the World. Okay? End of that one. Now, do you believe that science can completely explain God? Well, I've been saying it can't for over an hour. I'm not sure that I can add to that. Science is very successful because it asks narrow questions. Science can't completely explain me. I mean, you could put me in one of these special scanning, tunneling microscopes and so on. You'd never get to know me that way. Don't try. You will only get to know me if I reveal myself to you by speaking. It's the same with God. Science will study the stars, but it'll never tell you about the character and the love of God. In order to learn about that, God would have to reveal himself. The central Christian claim is that he has done that. The Word became human, and Christ is the Word of God incarnate. And so I believe that God has revealed himself to us. Now, be careful. This does not mean you shut off your reason. Some people who do not think about these things carefully say reason is opposed to revelation. That is utter nonsense. You can reason about me, but if I remain silent, you'll never get to know me. But once I speak, do you stop using your reason? Of course not. You have to think with your reason about what I say. It's exactly the same with God. If God does not speak, no amount of reason will get there. But once he speaks, you've got to use your reason on what he presents to you. So that's the beginnings of an answer to those questions. 2 more questions, I'm told, with great authority. Right, there's lots of things here, but why are you a Christian and not simply a theist? And there's another question, I'll take that as the second one, which says the same thing. How do you jump from theism to Christianity? Now, these questions are very legitimate and they're important. I was asked to speak on the question, has science buried God? That is strictly a question about the existence of God. It is not a question about Christianity. And I have developed that and kept to that topic. But now you ask me this, which is a personal question. And Would you like me to answer it? Because it is not on the topic. And so I'm happy not to answer it. But if you'd like me to answer it, you would have to forgive me if I gave you a personal answer. Is that okay? Well, that's very kind of you. Science can only get you so far. The New Testament recognizes that. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, says that the invisible things of God are evident in what is created. Two things. One, that there is a God, and two, that he's powerful, full stop. So in order to go further, you need more evidence. There are many religious claims in the world. And I am a Christian. Now, how can that be? Well, on the same basis as our considerations this evening, we have to ask for evidence. Jesus Christ claims to be God incarnate. That's a claim. It could be true, it could be false. What is the evidence for it? Now, this is a huge topic. And again, I'm afraid I've written books about it, including the one that was mentioned tonight, Gunning for God. But let me say one or two things. Evidence tends to come in two kinds. What we may roughly call objective and subjective. The evidence of history, of writings, and the evidence of human experience. And I am a Christian on the basis of evidence from those two sources. First of all, did Jesus exist? Well, Richard Dawkins says a good case can be made that he didn't exist, although he's gracious enough to say he doesn't accept that case, which is good because he says that a professor in London believes that. But he doesn't tell his readers that this is a professor of German, not a professor of ancient history. But I want to check things like that. Richard Dawkins is not an ancient historian. Can you find a single ancient historian in the world of repute that doesn't believe Jesus existed? I haven't yet found one. And some of them are atheists. And you can begin there, at that base level, and work your way up. Now, I'm a scientist, and one of the ways in which Jesus is claimed to have authenticated himself is through doing supernatural acts. We call them miracles. And for many of my colleagues, that's the end. They say, look, we cannot talk about miracles in the 21st century, certainly not as scientists, because the Enlightenment philosopher David Hume told us centuries ago that miracles are impossible because they are violations of the laws of nature. Now, I meet many people who believe that passionately, but in fact it's completely wrong. Now, very briefly, why is it wrong? Well, it results from confusing two meanings of the word law. I'm staying in a hotel tonight. Suppose I put 100 euros in my drawer last night. I put 100 euros in the drawer tonight, so I've got 200 euros, yes? I wake up tomorrow morning, open the drawer, and there are 50 euros in the drawer. What is my conclusion? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of Spain? Well, the laws of Spain. How do I know? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. You see, my mistake was to think that the drawer was a closed system. But a thief came and put his hand in and pulled out 150. The laws of arithmetic tell me that that has happened. because they haven't been broken. The mistake that Hume made, and many have made, is to think that the laws of arithmetic are like the laws of Spain. They've got force. If you break them, you'll have the police coming down on your neck. That's sheer nonsense. You see, God has made a universe with regularities in it which we recognize. We need to know them in order to recognize when God does something special, like raise Jesus from the dead. The ancient world were not primitive. They didn't think that people jumped up out of graves every Thursday afternoon. So when Jesus rose from the dead, they recognized it as a miracle because they knew that that did not normally happen. The laws of nature tell us what normally happens, but they're not causes. Nor do they hold God in a prison. He can feed a new event in by his power. And that's what he did when he raised Jesus from the dead. And so we could go on. And I do that in my book, Disparando contra Dios. But now let's come to the other side. In science, you test things. And people often ask me, how can you be a Christian? Because it's not testable. Of course it's testable. How? Well, Jesus Christ tells us that if we face the mess we've made of life and admit that we've done wrong, and are prepared to trust him as Savior and Lord, we will receive forgiveness and new life. Well, you can test that. I wouldn't sit here for a nanosecond if I hadn't seen that happen to people hundreds of times. I gave a lecture in Penn State University to several thousand people, and sometime later to a huge crowd at Harvard, and I don't know which way round it was, but after I'd finished, in the balcony, a Chinese student stood up and he shouted to everybody. He said, "Just look at me." And of course we all looked. And he addressed it to me, so I said, "Tell us." He said, "Look, I was in the other university some months ago where you spoke. I felt suicidal. My life was in a complete mess. I couldn't see any way out. I had no hope. And something you said that night made me start to think about Christianity. And a few weeks later, and this is the way he put it, I gave my life to Christ as a deliberate step of my will." And he said, "Just look at me." And he was radiant. And of course, it was one of the most powerful messages that could have been delivered. It's real, ladies and gentlemen. Why do so many people not become Christians? I want to explain why in just my final few moments. Have I got a final few moments? Have I? Please go if bus number 10 is about to leave. The reason is that people think of Christianity as a religion rather than a relationship. Now let me explain that. I ask many people from different religions to tell me, what is a religion? Well, they said it's a bit like the University of Madrid. You have some kind of ceremony that gets you into your course. And then you get lots of books and teachers and professors, and they're all very nice people, like Professor Pablo here. And they teach you and encourage you, but sitting in front of you is the day of judgment, finals, the final examination. And the professors say to you, "I help you all I can, but I cannot guarantee that you're going to get through that final exam. It's your merit." We all understand that, don't we? And so many people think that that is religion. They think that that is Christianity. We go through some ceremony, perhaps performed on us as an infant. We have various people that teach us and encourage us and tells us the rules and the regulations. And we hope one day that God will be kind and he'll not judge us too seriously and will receive us, yes? Ladies and gentlemen, that's religion. It's not Christianity. Christianity is the exact opposite of that. Now notice the principle. The principle is you try, you work, and you hope that you will be accepted. But you cannot know that you're accepted until that final assessment, yes? That's the way a lot of life works, isn't it? And it's why many people reject religion, including Christianity, because they regard that as a slavery that they cannot cope with. And so they just reject it. That's tragic. Because you see, what Christ offers is something totally different. And let me emphasize this. He does not compete with any other religion because he offers us something that none of them offer. He offers us acceptance at the beginning, not at the end. That's revolutionary. That's such a radical idea that many people say that is impossible. Well, it would be if it depended on my merit. But Christ offers me his acceptance at the beginning. How can he do that? Because his name is Jesus. You shall call his name Jesus because he shall save his people from their sins. And you know, at the heart of Christianity, there's a cross. Now, you may not understand how it works, just like we don't understand how gravity works and lots of other things work. But what it says is that when Christ died, he took upon himself my guilt completely. And God raised him from the dead. And so if I trust him, he takes the weight of all of that. And I receive, right now, eternal life. He that hears my words, said Jesus, and believes in him that sent me, has eternal life, and shall not come into judgment, but is passed from death to life. Let me explain that in a different way so you really grasp it. When I arrived in Cambridge, hundreds of years ago now it seems, I had a vision on the first day. She was beautiful, and she was 16. And she's been my wife for 50 years nearly. So I came to her one day and said, Sally, you know, I'd really like to marry you. Oh, yes? What an interesting idea. And here is a present for you. It's a cookery book. It's full of laws. How to make entrecote and apple cake. Thou shalt take so much sugar. Thou shalt take so much flour. And thou shalt, that kind of thing. And I said, look, if you keep the rules of this book, let's say for 40 years, then I'll think of accepting you. But of course I wouldn't do it now. And what's more, if you do not keep the rules, I shall send you back to your mother. But why are you laughing? That's how millions of people think of God. Now listen carefully. You would not insult a fellow human being by suggesting that your acceptance of them depended on their behavior for the next 40 years. So you think God's insulting you, does he? Do you? This is crucial. I cannot emphasize this enough because it's the reason so many people have rejected Christianity, because they think it's like that. What a back-breaking burden it would be for a woman to think, I've got to do this, I've got to try, I've got to bear the burden, and if I don't get it right, he will never accept me. That is not freedom. That is utter servitude and slavery. And the Christian good news is, well, it's the same as my marriage. Do you know, I accepted her at the very beginning. And she accepted me, which is amazing. And that's the strength of our marriage. I live now to please her, not to gain her love, but because I have got it. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm not ashamed to say to you that I live for God now. Not to gain his acceptance, but because I have already received it over 50 years ago, and he has never, ever let me down. You see, the biggest thing in my universe is this, that Christ loved me, and he died for me. And he was raised again for me, so that I can, in this unstable, uncertain world, have a certainty. Science cannot give me that. Science is fun. But these are the big things of life that go really deep. And so science has not buried God. And I believe there's powerful evidence to tell us that Jesus is exactly who he claimed to be. That he is God incarnate. Atheism gives us a tiny world that ends at 70 years, give or take a few, and then nothing. What a pathetic, hopeless faith it is. Christ comes from the other world and tells me this is not the only world. There is another one. And you can join me in my exploration of it, if you're prepared to trust me. There are millions of people in the world that are working for God in the hope that he will accept them. God is interested in our work, but he's far more interested in our trust. And any one of us can begin that journey tonight, precisely because it is a gift of God. It is not our merit. Buenas noches a todos. Muchísimas gracias.